Hi, I'm Mark Waldrop, Producing Artistic Director at Paper Mill Playhouse. All of us here at Paper Mill hope that you and your loved ones are safe and healthy during this time. While our theater is physically closed right now, we wanted to find a way to bring a theatrical experience right to you, to bring theater into your lives, into your homes. And so we've dug into our vaults and found these Humanities symposiums from the past. We'll be streaming them live each Thursday night at 7 p.m. Just tune in to our Paper Mill Facebook page and have a theatrical experience right from your couch. Hope to see you here each week.
So now we're ready to begin. Joining me at the piano and our musical raconteur, who will be telling us things about the music of the period of the great Ziegfeld, is our resident composer. Please welcome Albert Evans. Hi, Albert. Hello. So, the reason we're talking about the great Ziegfeld is that we did Follies and the Will Rogers Follies this season, and they recall the days of the great Follies review shows. The Will Rogers Follies, of course, is his story told against the background of the Ziegfeld Follies, and Follies itself, the Stephen Sondheim musical, is the imaginary Weissman Follies, but it's modeled after the famous Ziegfeld Follies. We're going to tell you about Mr. Ziegfeld and the 24 years of his Follies tonight. He was born on March 21st, 1868. He was definitely an Aries, absolutely. And I know, because I'm an Aries too. And so is Ann Miller, by the way, and she'll tell you that the minute she meets you. He was born in Chicago, and there's a joke in Will Rogers Follies, for those of you who've seen it. You know, his full name was Florence Ziegfeld, and the joke is that you'd have to be, if you grew up in Chicago, you'd have to be pretty tough to walk around with a name like Florence. So he really was quite a character and quite strong-minded and ambitious. His father was a doctor of music at the Chicago Musical College, very serious musician, and Florence did not care for his father's serious musical taste, although that's what his father wanted him to do. So at 17, he ran off and joined Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. His father came and found him and brought him back. And he said to Florence, he said, "It's a bad business, the show business, Florence. Better you should stay home and I will make you a business manager of the college." But it's a good thing he didn't heed his advice, because had he heeded his advice, he would not have become the greatest showman the world has ever known. What then happened was his father was asked to provide talent for the Chicago World's Fair. So Flo begged his father to let him select the talent. And he went to Europe and he found 7 bands to bring back from Europe to the Chicago World's Fair. The bands he brought back were horrifying, and it was a dismal failure. However, his next venture into being an entrepreneur paid off. He discovered the great Sandow. And I think we'll see his picture shortly. I think that's Ziegfeld, but then the next picture will be the great Sandow. He went to New York and he found this 23-year-old muscle man. It was said that his abdominal muscles, when tensed, produced a wonderful checkerboard effect. He could raise a dumbbell with a man on either side. He would raise the dumbbell with 2 men on either side of the dumbbell. He could raise a grand piano with men seated on the grand piano. And when he was tired, he would lay down on the floor and they put a plank on his chest and 3 horses would walk across his chest. Society ladies were escorted backstage to meet him and get a close-up look at his abdomen. He became an incredible success. People came from all over to see the phenomenon, the great Sandow. And Ziegfeld started making lots of money, and it was all through the way he promoted this man, and he was actually a phenomenon. He was really the first Arnold Schwarzenegger. You know, he made history by being this muscle man. However, Ziegfeld got a little too ambitious, and at one point when they were in San Francisco, he challenged Sandow to go into the ring and fight a lion that was there with the circus. And people paid so much money to be able to attend this event. It was really literally the Christians to the lions, you know. And they all went to see this, and either they had maybe drugged the lion, or the lion really wasn't so fierce, but the lion came out and kind of just rolled over and didn't really do much of anything. And it was really the end of Sandow because it was such a scam, they felt, whether it was or not, that that business was over and he had to get into something else. So next, he brought over the dancing ducks of Denmark. And as you can imagine, these didn't do terribly well. But then his luck changed forever because he met the beautiful Anna Held. And if we can see the beautiful Anna Held now, instead of the beautiful Sandow, there she is. And you can see how beautiful she was. She was a street singer in Paris originally. She sang a song that became very famous called "Won't You Come and Play With Me?" And she was an orphan of Jewish and Polish parents. And she eventually rose to singing in cabaret clubs. And he went over to Paris and saw her there and got this brilliant idea. She was very petite. She had an hourglass figure, and her beauty and her coy kind of way of tantalizing people with her sexual innuendos that were very subtle, but they were definitely something people hadn't seen before in America, captured the public's attention. In addition to that, she and Ziegfeld staged all kinds of amazing publicity stunts. She had 40 gallons of milk shipped in from New Jersey every day so that she could bathe in it. They lived in the Ansonia in New York. She lived with Ziegfeld. They became lovers. And she never married him, but she did become his common-law wife because they were together for 15 years. People did believe that they were married, but then eventually it was found out that they actually weren't ever really officially married. When she was in these milky baths, they would bring reporters in to see her in the milk to prove it because, you know, they were really wanting to know if that was for sure. And she said it gave her a creamy complexion. So you can imagine how much milk was sold in New Jersey that went to New York then when the ladies decided they were going to follow in Anna Held's footsteps. She would do naughty little things. She would lift her gown just so high, but higher than anyone had lifted it before, and tantalize people with her innuendos. He presented Anna Held in plays, and they always happened to have 13 letters in the title. The French Maid, Miss Innocence were two of the names, and they were very popular, and she was really a big success. They made lots of money. They had a private railway car. They had in their train, they would have oriental palms and settees and everything. They lived as they would travel around the country in style. They had a 5-piece band on the train, and they had their own chef that made all their own food. She would come back from Europe with sable coats made out of 110 pelts, of course, and it would always be in the newspaper. So everything she did was sensational, and they were quite the couple. And just to give you a little feeling, a little sample of the type of song Anna Held would sing, we have the lovely Miss Kelly Rabke to perform for you a song that Anna Held made famous. And here she is. Kelly?
No doubt you've seen the maiden with the dimple in her chin. A very charming girl is she. The maid with feet and ankles that a beauty prize would win. A very pretty sight to see. But the maiden that's most charming, all your wariness disarming, with seductiveness alarming, is the maiden with the dreamy eyes. There are eyes of blue, there are brown eyes too, there are eyes of every size, and eyes of every hue. But I surmise that if you are wise, you'll be careful of the maiden with the dreamy eyes. You get aboard a Broadway car and get a seat perhaps. That's quite a lucky thing to do. While aged female passengers are hanging on the straps, and everybody stares at you, with the crowd that still comes piling, comes a maid with eyes beguiling, and you give your seat up smiling to the maiden with the dreamy eyes. There are eyes of blue, there are brown eyes too, there are eyes of every size and eyes of every hue, but I surmise that if you are wise, you'll be careful of the maiden with the dreamy eyes.
At this time, the theater district on Broadway was actually between 23rd and 40th Streets, and there were over 40 theaters crowded into those few blocks on Broadway. And in with those theaters were all kinds of wonderful restaurants, and one of the famous restaurants was Rector's. And Mr. Rector himself was quoted as saying, "I found Broadway a quiet little lane of ham and eggs and left it a full-blown avenue of lobsters and champagne." And it was quite the spot. The shows, the glamour, the whole idea of nightlife in New York was centered in that area. There were two huge theater owners, the two chains, the Schubert chain, which of course many of you know about, which had theaters in New York and then all over the country, and Claw and Erlanger also had big chains all over the country. They always were in competition, these two chains. Both of those big producers and managers wanted to have Anna Held and be able to present her in their theaters across the country. Ziegfeld toyed with Schubert for a long time. He was actually toying with both, but to keep the money getting larger and larger, and finally he dropped Schubert and went with Claw and Erlanger. They were so furious with him that they really punished him by never, ever allowing any of Ziegfeld's shows to ever be presented in a Schubert theater for the rest of his life. This was quite difficult in later life for Mr. Ziegfeld. Now Anna helped Ziegfeld come up with his greatest idea, and maybe one of the greatest ideas in show business. She said to him, "You know, your American girls, they're so beautiful. Why don't you do a show with lots of girls, not just one?" And he said, "Well, why not? 50 girls, all in one show." And he called it, at first, The Follies of the Year, but she reminded him that this was now 13 letters. So he changed it to The Follies of 1907. And this was the first Ziegfeld Follies. It wasn't called the Ziegfeld Follies at this time. It would soon become that. But in the first season, it was called The Follies of 1907. And what it was, at this time, you know, vaudeville was very popular. And vaudeville was a series of just one variety number after another. There was nothing to connect it together. But what he did was he took the review form, and it was a series of numbers, dances, comedy sketches, but they were strung together with a very light storyline, but at least it gave it an arc and a shape and a theme. This happened to be, the first theme was Captain John Smith and Pocahontas on a present-day visit to New York City. So you can just imagine what they were seeing through the Ziegfeld Follies here. But the big thing of this was his 50 girls, who were called the Anna Held Girls. She never appeared in the Follies herself, but he did call the girls the Anna Held Follies. She always appeared in separate productions that he made for her. At one point, she actually did appear on a film clip in the Follies, but she was never a star of the Follies herself. He thought, he went whole hog, and he did have a lot of money at this time, so he was able to put on quite a show. He had 100 musicians, there were 13 magnificent scenes, and women glorified everywhere. When he would choose fabric for the costumes, and this would become a trademark for him because he really wanted only the best, if someone presented him with $50 a yard fabric or $30 a yard fabric, he always would choose $30 a yard. This particular show was quite a success, and he made a profit of $120,000, which was quite a lot of money in 1907. So in 1908, he came back with another one. He had thought it was going to be a series, but it suddenly started to develop that way. He brought in Nora Bayes to star with Jack Norworth, and they wrote and sang what would become the first very famous song from the Follies, and you'll all know it. We're going to sing it in just a moment. This was presented in the Erlanger Theater in New York, and this one really hit. This was even bigger than the Follies of 1907. And in this one, instead of having Pocahontas and John Smith walk around the streets of New York, he substituted Adam and Eve. And this is when they also began, the comics began to satirize current people of the day. And this would become very big, and as you see in the Will Rogers Follies, it was a theme that's very much carried on by Will Rogers, who we'll talk about momentarily. And people would become very honored, in fact, if they were given some dig from the Follies stage. And it was a big thing to actually be mentioned in the Follies. And this is the beginning of that, which would continue for the next 23 years. The Follies of 1909 came around. This one, as they were rehearsing out of town, they had quite an interesting singer-comedian in the show named Sophie Tucker. But she didn't feel her material was up to what she wanted to do, and she left out of town. She never actually performed in the Ziegfeld Follies in New York, but he actually discovered Sophie Tucker. In this particular one, the girls, one of the big features was that the girls wore warships on their heads, huge warships, and there was a big parade with the girls with the warships. We'll tell you a lot about the various things he did with the girls as we go on tonight. But in this one, the new star of this was Lillian Lorraine, who was said to be the most beautiful woman in the world. And one of her famous songs was, she would fly out over the audience in an airplane and scatter roses on them. She had her little aviator thing. There she is in her little aviator costume. But we have another picture of her where she's really quite dressed up, quite lovely. And Ziegfeld, if we can go to that next picture, you'll see her. Ziegfeld fell in love with Lillian Lorraine. Now, he's still living with Anna Held at the Ansonia. So he got Lillian a suite at the Ansonia as well. And she was Ziegfeld's favorite. That whole idea of Ziegfeld's favorite from the Will Rogers Follies really is based on this Lillian Lorraine arrangement. We'll tell you what happened between Anna and Lillian in a moment, but Lillian had her own song that became the second big hit tune in the Follies, and the two songs that we're going to sing for you now happen to be about a very similar subject. And here we have Mary Lee DeWitt, Joseph Sark, Jennifer Clippinger, and Kevin Steele to perform these two very famous songs for you, which originated in the Ziegfeld Follies.
Shine on, harvest moon, up in the sky. I ain't had no lovin' since January, February, June or July. Snow time, ain't no time to stay outdoors and spoon. So shine on, harvest moon, for me and my gal.
Place, park, scene dark, silvery moon is shining through the trees.
Cast to me, you, sound of kisses floating on the breeze.
Act 1, begun, dialogue.
Where would you like to spoon my cue with you
Underneath the silvery moon, by the light of the silvery moon, I want to spoon to my honey I'll croon love's tune. Honeymoon, keep us shining in June. Your silvery beams will bring love dreams. We'll be cuddling, we'll cuddle soon by the silvery moon. Your silvery beams will bring love dreams. We'll be cuddling soon, we'll cuddle soon by the silvery moon. My God.
So, Shine on Harvest Moon became a magnificent hit all around the world, as did By the Light of the Silvery Moon. And Lily in the Rain actually, many years later, after Mr. Ziegfeld's death, was asked to sing again for a special tribute at the New Amsterdam Theater. And they asked her to come up and sing By the Light of the Silvery Moon, and she got on the stage, but she was so overcome with grief, it was soon after he had died, that she wasn't able to sing it. She was desperately in love with Florenz Ziegfeld, and so was Anna Held, very much. Ziegfeld was the love of her life. And even though they weren't really married, they became divorced in 1918. And Anna would eventually die she died before 1918, a couple years before that. She divorced a little bit before 1918. She died in 1918. And she died actually from a bone infection that was brought about from all those corsets she wore to squeeze herself in. The bones actually became infected, and it was all of her dieting and corseting that really brought about the end. So her beauty really brought about her demise. She asked for Florenz on her deathbed, but he never came back to her. And if any of you have ever seen the movie of the great Ziegfeld, Louise Reiner won the Oscar for playing Anna Held in that film. And it's a magnificent performance, and you really get the charm and heartbreak of this very interesting woman in that movie. The other famous character in his life will show up in a moment, because there's another woman in his life which is even very more important, and we'll talk about her with Lilian in a second. But we come to the Follies of 1910. Now in this Follies, some of the features were this number called Swing Me High, Swing Me Low, where the girls swung way out over the audience on swings. Now we've seen that used many times, but this was really where it first became popular in the Ziegfeld Follies. He also had a huge swimming tank that was brought into the center of the stage, a glass tank, and the big thing was to see the girls jump in and come out in their bathing suits, but all wet. And this was really tantalizing for everybody to see ladies running around wet in their bathing suits on a stage. That was a first. But the big feature of this show, and it really was groundbreaking, was Ziegfeld's inclusion in this of a wonderful singing comedian named Bert Williams. And not only was he amazingly talented, the one thing that was amazing about this was that he was the first black man to appear in a white theater that wasn't showing a whole black show. He was a black man in a white show. And this was scandalous at the time, but Ziegfeld stood behind him, and Bert Williams became so popular that he was a star of the Follies for many years and was making $1,400 a week at that time. And the audiences just adored him, and it was a very strong move for Ziegfeld, and we'll see a lot more about that later as he really broke down a lot of prejudicial barriers in his career. One of the interesting thing about Bert Williams, he really was so popular in the Follies that once he took a bet to go down to this place called the Miners Bowery Theater where they had an amateur night, and he went out on the stage, announced by another name, doing an imitation of Bert Williams, and he was booed off the stage. So they loved him at the Follies, but when he tried to be somebody else, it all changed. But he was very popular, and one of the songs that he sang was Nobody. Jim Hindman is going to sing for us tonight that song, but if you can, Bert is here on the far, on your right, that's Bert. And this was actually a scene called Dahomey, which was a popular thing at the time. In another, it wasn't actually in the Ziegfeld show, this was another show. And here we have next a caricature of Bert, and Jim Hindman now is going to sing for us Nobody. Please welcome Jim Hindman.
When life seems full of clouds and rain, and I am filled with naught but pain, who soothes my thumping, bumping brain? Nobody. When winter comes with snow and sleet, and me with hunger and cold feet, who says, here's 2 bits, go and eat? Nobody. I ain't never done nothing to nobody, and I ain't never got nothing from nobody, no time. And until I get something from somebody sometime, I don't intend to do nothing for nobody, no time. When I try hard and scheme and plan to look the best that e'er I can, who says, look at that handsome man? Nobody. When all day long things go amiss and I go home to find some bliss, who hands to me a glowing kiss? Nobody. I ain't never done nothing to nobody, and I ain't never got nothing from nobody, no time. And until I get something from somebody sometime, I don't intend to do nothing for nobody, no time. No, I don't intend to do nothing, and I don't intend to say nothing, and I don't intend to do nothing for nobody, no time.
Bert Williams again starred in the Follies of 1911, and there was a new act that Ziegfeld discovered and brought to the public's attention, the Dolly Sisters. These were two Hungarian twins that were very, very, very beautiful, really incredibly beautiful. In their first appearance in the Follies, they pretended to be Siamese twins, but that soon sort of didn't work so well, and he just let them be who they really were. And they had, that's a whole story unto itself. They eventually, their story became a movie, if you remember. Some of you probably have seen the Dolly Sisters. And they were quite famous in that era. Then the Follies of 1912 came along, and there was quite a famous song that came from that, which unfortunately, Albert and I couldn't find anywhere who the actual singer was of this, except that it was the famous song. We don't know who actually sang this in the Follies, but it's a song I think most of you will know. And please welcome Mark Waldrop, who's going to sing it for us now.
Young Johnny Jones, he had a cute little boat, and all the girlies he would take for a float. He had girlies on the shore, sweet little peaches by the score. But Johnny Jones, he was a smart one, you know. His steady girl was Flo. And every Sunday afternoon, she'd jump in the boat and they would spoon. And then he'd row, row, row. Way up the river he would row, row, row. A hug he'd give her, he would kiss her now and then. She would tell him when. They'd fool around, and then they'd kiss again. And then he'd row, row, row. A little further he would row. Then he'd drop both his oars, take a few more encores, and then he'd row, row, row. Oh, he would row, row, row. Way up the river he would row, row, row. A hug he'd give her, he would kiss her now and then. She would tell him, hiya dear. They'd fool around, and then they'd kiss again. And then he'd row, row, row. A little further he would row. They would drift to an isle and explore for a while, and then he'd row, row, row. She'd cajole and she'd coax. He perfected his strokes, and then he'd row, row, row. Once again he would prove how that dinghy could move, and then he'd row, row, row. Oh yes, he'd row, row, row. How he would row, 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 row.
Now we come to the most famous female star of the Ziegfeld Follies. And the irony is that she wasn't one of the great beauties, but she was one of the greatest talents of the American stage, Fanny Brice. She first actually came to the Follies in 1910 and continued to be in the Follies for many years after that. The first song she sang in the Follies was written by Irving Berlin, and it was called Goodbye, Becky Cohen. She would do a combination of witty little parody sketches and these cute novelty songs, which really brought to life these wonderful, colorful characters that people were seeing all around New York at the time. And she had a great charisma, as you all know if you've seen Funny Girl or Funny Lady. How this character was portrayed by Barbra Streisand and brought to great fame in our time. But you can imagine what she must have been like in her time. Of course, it is quite true that she did have the love of her life was a gambler named Nicky Arnstein, and we're going to tell you a little bit more about that in a moment. But to give you a flavor of the kind of thing that Miss Fanny Brice would do, please welcome our own comedian from Paper Mill, Miss Susie Speidel.
I never get a single thing that's new. Thank you. Even Jake the plumber, he's the man I adore. He had the nerve to tell me he's been married before. Everyone knows that I'm just second-hand rose from Second Ave. Once while strolling through the Ritz, a girl got my goat. She nudged her friends and said, "Oh look, there goes my last year's coat." Everyone knows that I'm just second-hand rose from Second Avenue. No? You should come to my neighborhood sometime. We got all kinds of people there. Yeah, really. Becky was a dancer. See how she danced. Nighttime and day, she tiptoed away. She got a job in the ballet. One night, her foot made a slip. She fell on her back with such a crack. They thought she located her hip. They thought she was dead from a bump on her head. She should be in bed, but instead, Becky is back in the ballet, kicking her foot to the skies. Becky is back in the ballet, doing a sweet butterfly. Look how she goes up on her toes. She can pose on her toes, on her big brother's nose. She slides, she can slither, hither and thither. Her feet, they go with her. She holds up a foot, then she smiles with the face. She skittles and trickles all over the place. She shakes with a shiver, she quakes with a quiver. Her mother and father will never forgive her, since Becky is back in the ballet. Becky is back in the ballet, kicking away with her feet. Becky is back in the ballet. Look, she can do a split. She kicks to the front, to the back, to decide. One day she'll kick and commit suicide. She kneels, it's a twister. From kneeling so much on her knee is a blister. She goes all around the place. She gets herself dizzy, then falls on her face. No one can endure her, they'll kill her or cure her. Her father and mother is going to insure her, since Becky is back in the ballet. Come, Becky, darling. Mama wants you should dance for Tante Bloom and the company. Oi, such a dancer. Look how she does it. Push up on your foot, sweetheart, but don't break the toes. Look how she goes around and she never gets dizzy. Now do for Mama the dying duck like Pavlova. She's what you call a Russian ballet. Oh, what balance. What balance? I don't understand it. Her father should have such a balance. Honeysuckle, don't forget the twist. For that I pay $2 a lesson. Look out, darling, look out, but don't break your technique. Her father and mother is going to insure her, since Becky is back in the ballet.
Now, there was one song that Fanny Brice made famous, and it was totally uncharacteristic. It was the only song that she sang of this kind in all of her years in the Follies, but Ziegfeld was very clever. He actually monopolized on a tremendous situation because Fanny's husband, Nicky Arnstein, was sent to prison for embezzlement, and he was the love of her life. And so he found this song that was a French song called Mon Homme, and he translated it into English. And everybody knew Fanny's story, and when she sang this song, there wasn't a dry eye in the house.
It's cost me a lot, but there's one thing that I've got. It's my man. Cold and wet, tired, you bet, but all that I soon forget with my man. He's not much on looks, and no hero out of books is my man. 2 or 3 girls has he that he likes as well as me, but I love him. I don't know why I should. He isn't good, he isn't true, he beats me too. What can I do? Oh, my man, I love him so, he'll never know. All my life is just despair, but I don't care. When he takes me in his arms, the world is bright. All right. What's the difference if I say I'll go away, when I know I'll come back on my knees someday? For whatever my man is, I am his forevermore. Oh, my man, I love him so, he'll never know, but I'll come back on my knees someday. For whatever my man is, I am his
Our very own Fanny Bryce. Now, we come to, if I can find my page here, yes, the Follies of 1913. And this was a momentous year for the Follies because it moved into the New Amsterdam Theater, which, if many of you have followed what's happened in New York with the renovation of 42nd Street, the New Amsterdam Theater has been restored to its magnificent glory. And if you can imagine, if we can see the slides of the New Amsterdam Theater, if we have them here. This was the facade of the Ziegfeld when the Follies was at the New Amsterdam Theater, which has now been restored. But if we look inside, if you haven't gotten to see that theater yet, that's where The Lion King is playing. It is, I think, the most beautiful theater I've ever seen. It's certainly the most beautiful theater in America. It's been restored impeccably. And if we can go to the next slide, there are all of these beautiful details all over the theater. And if we can go to the next slide, you'll see the interior. If you haven't been in there yet, you can get a feeling for it. Here it comes. We're bleeding a little at the bottom because we can't quite make it all fit. But the murals and all the work that's been restored has been very lovingly done. The colors are magnificent. And this was the theater that the Follies would play in for quite a few years. It was it was run by Mr. Erlanger, who was the Erlanger chain as opposed to the Schubert chain. So they ended up in the New Amsterdam Theater. And on the rooftop of that theater was, Ziegfeld would open another theater which would become his rooftop theater. So there were two theaters that were operating. And we'll talk a little bit about that a little later with one of our guests. The Follies of 1913 featured a song called Peg of My Heart. And at this time there was a very popular play. One of the really popular plays of this era was Peg of My Heart. It was done all the time and ran many performances. So Ziegfeld, to capture this, decided to have a song written with that title, which the audience would love. And here is that song now, sung by Jim Hindman, Peg of My Heart.
Peg of my heart, I love you, don't let us part. I love you, I always knew it would be you. Since I heard your lilting laughter, it's your Irish heart I'm after. Peg of my heart, your glances make my heart say, how's chances? Come be my own, come make your home in my heart. Peg of my heart, I love ya, we'll never part. I love ya, dear little girl, sweet little girl, sweeter than the rose of Erin, are your winning charms endearing. Peg of my heart, your glances with Irish art and trances, come be my own, come make your home in my heart.
When the Follies of 1914 opened, Ziegfeld's life would change because he met a woman named Mary William Ethelbert Appleton Burke, but she became to be affectionately known by everyone as Billie Burke. And you all know her because she played Glinda in the movie of The Wizard of Oz. But she was quite an amazing movie star in her own right, especially at this time, and a theater and movie star. He met her. She arrived at a costume party with Somerset Maugham, and she was quite beautifully dressed, and she arrives coming down the staircase, and he was there with Lillian Lorraine, and he saw Billie, and he figured out some way to get Lillian to get mad at him, and Lillian stormed out. And he then got Billie away from Somerset Maugham and danced with her all evening. And Billie recalls, she remembers the evening, of course, because it was the beginning of her great romance with him. But she remembers that on the sidelines was this woman dressed like the Empress Josephine, who had these horribly scathing, rude looks with her all night long, and everywhere she went, this woman was staring her down. She later found out that that was Anna Held. So the three women actually were in the same room at the same time. Her father was a circus clown who was named, a famous circus clown named Billy Burke, and she took his name as her stage name. And they were married, Billy Burke and Florence Ziegfeld were married in Hoboken on April 11th, 1914. It was actually an elopement, and they were married for the remainder of the next 18 years of Ziegfeld's life, till the end of his life. We'll talk a little bit more about why he chose her over Lillian Lorraine in a moment, but it's interesting to find out. They moved to Hastings-on-Hudson to a house that Billy owned. She was in this house, but when they were married and they moved in, Ziegfeld spent $250,000 in 1914 to remodel it. That's a lot of money. He created a menagerie. He had animals of every kind walking the grounds. He had Japanese tea houses. He had separate bungalows for him, for Billy, for everybody, so that if they wanted to work and do other things, they could go off in their own little way. And he had dozens of roses delivered daily. It was quite this romantic little retreat. Kids would actually, from the town, would climb the walls and look over to see what was going on there because it was a fantasy spot. But the irony of all of that is, and they would spend most of the rest of their life there, but in the end, when the Depression came and they actually sold the house, they could only get $35,000 for it. And subsequently, the home was torn down. In fact, Billy Burke had always made quite a bit of money on her own. She never appeared in the Ziegfeld Follies either. She was always doing her own plays and movies, and she did have her own money, so that when the Depression did hit, and it hit Ziegfeld hard, he lost $1 million immediately and was bankrupt in the Depression. She bailed him out with $500,000 of her own and saved his show and his career, and continued to do that and paid debts of his after he had died as well. So this is what she said about him when she first met him, and these are two quotes from Billy Burke. "Even if I had known then precisely what tortures and frustrations were in store for me during the next 18 years because of this man, I should have kept right on falling in love. I was destined to be jealous of the entire Follies chorus as well as the Follies star list for the rest of my married life." So he was quite the woman's man, but she stuck beside him through all of it. So we come to the Follies of 1915. This was the beginning of the great era of the Follies, when the shows really would reach their peak for the next 10-year period. And at the same time, he would open the Midnight Frolics, which were on the roof of the Amsterdam Theater, which we'll hear also a little bit more about in a moment. But in this, at this rooftop, one of the famous showgirls of his, named Dolores, appeared in the white peacock costume, if we can get that. There she is. And she was his greatest showgirl. She was this statuesque beauty known only as Dolores. And this is when these lavish costumes came to be at their height. There was the peacock, and there's another picture of it, I think, that might be a little easier to see. They had to have quite strong back and arms, I think, to carry these costumes around. And one of the famous costumes that came from the Frolics was a butterfly costume, which we used as one of our ideas for the production of Follies that we did here, this butterfly, and then we used that image in our opening of Follies. If we can see those slides. Way up in the air, you see our butterfly, because she ascended up into the flies, and we see the next picture, you'll get a better picture of it. But just to give a feeling of what some of those tremendous effects must have been like in the Ziegfeld Follies. The showgirls were costumed by Lady Duff Gordon. She was quite a swanky woman who really came up with these amazing designs, and she was his primary costume designer. Her sister was Eleanor Glynn, if any of you know history. She was the woman who coined the idea of the It Girl. And the It Girl and the showgirls of Ziegfeld became quite synonymous with being these girls that had something quite special. And we'll see many pictures of these girls in a moment. But now we must talk about the other designer, which really transformed the Ziegfeld approach and the Ziegfeld touch, Joseph Urban. And when Ziegfeld discovered him and brought him to do the Follies, he would stay with him for the rest of his career, and I think was one of the greatest set designers of all time. And I think the only person that can tell us more about him is our greatest set designer, Michael Anania. Please welcome Michael. Here he is.
Good evening. Carl Maria Georg Joseph Urban was born in Vienna, May 26, 1872. By the age of 26, he had designed a castle for Count Esterhazy in Hungary, the exhibition building of the Hagenbad in Vienna, the Saar Bridge over the Neva River in Petrograd, decorated the Abdin Palace for the Khedive of Egypt. Quite some accomplishment for a 26-year-old. He also illustrated several German books, including the complete Grimm's fairy tales. In 1989, he built and decorated 3 pavilions for the Kaiser's Jubilee Exposition, for which he was awarded the Gold Cross, and in 1899, he won another medal for his design of the Austrian exhibition in Venice. His first connections with the stage began in Vienna at the Vienna Berg Theater, and between 1904 and 1912, he designed over 50 productions in some of the foremost theaters of Europe, including Vienna Royal Opera House, Paris Opera, and Covent Garden. In 1904, Urban assisted with the Austrian Pavilion at the St. Louis Fair and began designing for the Boston Opera Company. In 1912, at the age of 40, he became the stage director, what today we would consider our artistic director, I believe, for the Boston Opera. Could we have the next slide, please, George? This slide shows at the foot of Montmartre, 1912, a design for the Boston Opera production of Louise, a new opera of the period. In the next slide, we see another of his early designs for Boston Opera, The Love of Three Kings. At first, the staid Boston critics were dismayed by his experiments in the new stagecraft. Urban's aim was always to find the overall tone, color, and atmosphere by emphasizing essentials, working for effect by the simplest means, and doing away with the hackneyed tricks of decoration and false perspective. So he began to be quite an innovator in stage design and brought all the theater craft that was happening in Europe at the time of Gordon Craig and Adolphe Appia to America. He introduced new ideas to the American design world for the next 10 or 15 years, actually. Portals, which frame the stage, were an invention of Urban.
Like this one right here.
Like this portal right here. Platforms were never used, or rarely used before this, and he developed platform systems to either make the stage seem more intimate, or to seem vaster if he used a huge rake stage, which you've seen in art theater many times. Color, however, was the most striking element in Urban's work. He used the impressionistic technique of pointillage, like Monet or Seurat. So he brought a new painting technique to this country, using small dots of color to create a very magical effect. And he was very well known for his lighting effects, when many hours were spent in technical rehearsals getting the lighting effects just right. And that was no mean feat in that time, considering how primitive the lighting systems were. Urban's method for designing, after reading a play or libretto, he would do a very detailed ground plan of the way the show was to look, then very small but accurate color drawings and very detailed models. In 1914, Urban went to Paris, the Opera Company of Boston, and became stranded in Italy. George Tyler at this time is said to have brought him back to America to design the scenery for the Garden of Paradise. At this time, because of World War I, the Opera Company of Boston had closed. He was looking for employment. He was offered several positions, but he decided to do this play because he wanted to work on Broadway. The next slide shows the set from, one of the sets from The Garden of Paradise, which was a play by Edward Selden. The next slide shows another of those scenes. You can see in these slides the pointillistic approach to painting that he used throughout, and also a very fresh look of the new movement, the Art Deco movement, that was coming to play in America at this time. This play, The Garden of Paradise, was a total disaster, but the sets were said to be amazing. And it was at this time that Jean Bach, Flo Ziegfeld's right-hand man, heard about them and went to see them, and apparently dragged Mr. Ziegfeld to see this scenery, and Flo was hooked. He knew this was to be his designer. And apparently Ziegfeld sent word to Urban that he'd like him to have him fix his roof. And Urban replied, does he mean, with some asperity, that he's got a leak? The roof that he was talking about, that Flo Ziegfeld was talking about, was a room at the top of the New Amsterdam Theater for the Midnight Frolic, which was considered Flo's latest folly. No one thought it would be a success, but it became a world-famous attraction. It was the forerunner of the modern floor show and flourished until 1922, and it ended because of Prohibition. Urban turned the roof into a glittering nightclub with a movable stage, glass balconies, and cross lighting to create stunning rainbow effects. Several stars emerged in this room, one being Will Rogers, the other Eddie Cantor. However, back to the main Follies, the cast for the 1915 Follies included W.C. Fields, Ed Wynn, Ina Claire, Ann Pennington, Burt Williams, Leon Earl, Mae Murray, George White, Olive Thomas, and Justine Johnstone. But the real star was Joseph Urban. In the next slide, we see one of the scenes from the 1915 Follies called Behold Thy Wife. And it's interesting because it's really the first time that three-dimensional scenery is used in this country the way Urban used it. We're used to wing and drop shows with pieces of furniture or just drapery being used. The next slide is also from the 1915 Follies. It's set for a bath scene, and you can see the elephants. These were a passion of Flo Ziegfeld, the elephants. Apparently these elephants actually spouted water and were used to frame used as a portal, and also to frame the famous staircase, the center staircase, that was also a trademark of Joseph Urban. Like the artist designing for Diagelo's Ballet Russe, Urban did more than merely create a frame for the performers. In the next slide, which is called Zeppelin over London, was also for the 1915 Follies. You can see his use of pointillism again, and his great use of perspective. He provided the continental elegance Ziegfeld had been searching for. His architectural stage decor was new, and the opulence was astonishing. Slide 9, the next slide we're going to see here, shows a very unusual setting called a nightclub with tenement, but it was also from the 1915 Follies. So you can see that the various looks and the various aspects of the review had very different looks. The entire physical production was polished to a great luster, and Ziegfeld was very aware of Urban's contribution. During the rest of his career, Flo Ziegfeld had to have Joseph Urban design his scenery. There was only one time that he didn't, and that was for a production called Betsy. And the show was going badly, and apparently Flo called on Joseph to come in and design the last set for it. But it was too late. The show couldn't be saved by the one new set by Joseph Urban. The next slide is the Garden of Eden, which we would call a show curtain, and this was for a Ziegfeld-Dillingham production. It's a 1916 musical, and it would be your typical show curtain, painted in very, very lush colors. When Flo Ziegfeld asked Urban to work for him, Urban accepted the job only after issuing an ultimatum. He said, I do not make the scenery to fit your material. I design scenery first, and then you put material to it.
It's just like Michael.
Just like we do it here. Yeah, if you believe that. The 1915 Follies became known as the Blue Follies because of Urban's use of the color blue. It was also happened to be one of Flo Ziegfeld's favorite colors, along with the color pink. But actually, Urban has a color named after him. It is called Urban Blue, and it's a very rich, intense sky blue that actually happens to be one of Robert's favorite colors. In the next slide, this is a set for the opening set, actually, or opening show curtain for the 1916 Follies. And it's very beautifully painted. The next three slides are all from the 1916 Follies. If we just go through those quickly, we go to the next one. You can see the variety in Urban's work in how magical and breathtaking it actually was.
This was the Follies that would star Will Rogers. This was his first starring role in the Follies, which we'll talk about right after this.
Urban also developed the idea of an in-one drop, so that a solo performer could be performing downstage while other scenery was being changed upstage, and it made, especially in a review situation, the show flow much more quickly. Because apparently when Flo Ziegfeld hired Urban, he told him that things must flow quickly. One of the reasons that first Broadway show failed, The Garden of Paradise, was that it took much too long to go from set to set. It took much too long to change the scenery.
Because what they would do is they would just
Stop.
They would just stop and play some music.
And bring down the curtain.
And wait, play music, and then go on. And they would change the whole set and go on. But you can imagine how drawn out that would be if you had a lot of scenes.
It would take a very long time to get through a show. In the next slide, we see a rather unusual set. It was for the 1919 Follies, and it's called Rose of China. And it's a two-decker setting with lots of translucent gauze drapes, which were apparently very unusual. It was very unusual to use that kind of reality on stage. The next slide. This was done in 1921, the 1921 Follies for Fanny Bryce, for My Man. This is her set, and it was obviously an in-one drop. And it was a Paris setting, very kind of lonely feeling. Urban worked as Ziegfeld's principal designer until 1931 and created the scenic decor for over 60 productions. In the next 4 slides, we can take a look at some of these. We have the next slide, George. This is a delicate example of rural nostalgia from the 1920s Follies. The next one is a Venetian scene for the 1921 Follies. Now these wouldn't just be backdrops, these would be sketches, and that actually would have been columns and then perhaps a built piece in the back. Unfortunately, there were no real production photos of any of the scenery that we could find to actually see what a set really looked like. This is an Arabian Nights curtain done in the 1920s. And this next slide is called Road to the Inn for the 1924 Follies. The next jungle scene This is actually a terrace scene that was designed for the 1922 Follies. And the next one is the jungle scene. And although this was designed for a much later Follies, I showed it now. This was for 1931 Follies because it looks like a sketch, but this is really a photograph of one of his models. And many of Urban's models still exist. Columbia has them. And we were fortunate enough to get a photograph of this model. It shows the intricacy of his model building in his painting. Urban was second only to Florence Ziegfeld himself in helping to extend the life of the Follies for many, many seasons. During the period of 1915 to 1927, he created the Follies staircase, as I mentioned, and it became a centerpiece for many of the show's editions. In 1917, more than 1/3 of the $140,000 spent on production costs were spent on sets, so about $5,000 for scenery, which was 5 times the average Broadway budget. We could only do it for that much today. When coming to New York, Urban opened his own Urban Scenic Studios. He brought in European scenic artists who developed the floor method of painting with brushes on long handles as opposed to the American method, which was painting on big frames. He developed translucent drops using starches and aniline dyes, and his method of scene painting became the adopted method in America. Within a few years, he was the most active designer of plays and musicals on Broadway. Besides his portals and three-dimensional scenery, he also introduced revolving periactoids or revolving prisms to frame changing backdrops. He was quite an innovator. He had not one style, but shifted stylistically from realism, abstraction to symbolism. He was also a knowledgeable theater architect and was asked to design a new Metropolitan Opera House, but it was designed but never built. In 1920, he decided to design for motion pictures and designed, in 10 years, he designed some 40 pictures, mostly for the Hearst Cosmopolitan Studios and Fox Films. And in 1916, he introduced the curved cyclorama, or sky drop, to give the stage greater depth, which is something we still use today when we can. He took 10 weeks to design the first Follies of 1915 and received $5,000 for the sketches, and he also did the scene painting. In later Follies, he received $30,000 just for the sketches. He always, however, painted some scenes for every show that Flo did after 1914.
That could pause. We're going to Michael's going to be back to tell us the continuing story in a moment, but thank you for this first part of the urban story.
You're welcome.
There's another half to it coming up. Thank you, Michael. Now, the Follies of 1916 did star Will Rogers. He was a discovery of Mr. Ziegfeld's. Mr. Ziegfeld also discovered W.C. Fields and Ed Wynn. He brought them out of obscurity and made them stars. Betty Blake, Will Rogers' wife, first saw her husband perform his act in Newark, and she was terribly bored by it, she said. But it didn't seem to bother Mr. Ziegfeld. He never gave Will Rogers a contract. They didn't have one. Will Rogers said he didn't want a contract. He wanted just a handshake, and that's how it remained with them for the next 10 years. He was the only comedian whose act Ziegfeld would watch. Whenever the comedians would come on, Ziegfeld would go off into his office, and he couldn't bear to watch them. But he loved Will Rogers because he was fresh every night. He always brought the topical ideas of the day. He would just walk out, and whatever came to him is what his act was, with a few rope tricks thrown in. And the first show that he appeared in was actually had a Shakespearean theme, and some of the events were a travesty of Romeo and Juliet and a travesty of Antony and Cleopatra, which took place in front of a massive sphinx. So you can imagine how refreshing it was to have a little cowboy come out in the middle of all of that. Now, that same year, Ziegfeld opened another show. He started now to do other musicals that weren't Ziegfeld shows, and this was called The Century Girl, and it became an equally successful show. So he had his Follies and The Century Girl running at the same time. And to take a break from the Follies, here is a song that was in that, The Century Girl, written by Victor Herbert, and it's called Kiss Me Again, and it's sung by Dee Belia. Dee?
Sweet summer breeze, whispering trees, stars shining softly above, roses in bloom, wafted perfume, sleepy birds dreaming of love, safe in your arms, far from alarms, daylight champagne with a tenderly pressed close to your breast. Kiss me again. Kiss me again. Kiss me. Kiss me
In the Follies of 1917, Ziegfeld discovered Eddie Cantor, who became also a gigantic musical comedy star. He started in the Follies. He was a great friend of Will Rogers. He also was very philanthropic and a generous individual, and both of them were really beloved. That year, Ziegfeld also decided to open another show that was not a Folly show. This was called Miss 1917, and it was a major flop. So he really didn't always have a hit. But the Follies of 1918 did very well, and at this point, he started to branch out even more into musical comedy, and he discovered his new young star who would become the reigning queen of musical comedy for the next few years. Her name was Marilyn Miller. And if we can see Marilyn, that's not Marilyn, that's Eddie. Nope, that's not her either. There she is. Okay, and we can look at Marilyn as we talk about her. She was this adorable pixie little lady who was the girl next door. She could sing, she could dance, she could do everything, and everybody just fell in love with her. She was quite the star, and she was also quite temperamental. But I think Ziegfeld saw in her he was sort of a father figure to her. And he kind of took care of her moods and her tantrums, whatever she wanted. He treated her as a father. She never really could get under his skin. He would let her do whatever she wanted. She complained about her costumes at one point, and there was a point where she was actually being given a new costume every night. He would have a new costume made for her, and she wore a different costume every night in the show she was doing just because she had a whim about that. Those costumes would cost $175 a piece, which would be the equivalent of $2,000 now. So he was paying that for a new costume for every night. Her first musical success was Sally, then she did Sunny, and eventually did Rosalie, which was very, very popular. She unfortunately died at the age of 41, so she had a very flashing, brilliant career for a short time and was one of Broadway's finest actresses. She became the highest paid star Ziegfeld ever paid. She paid her the most money. So now we come to the legendary Follies of 1919. This is thought to have been the greatest Follies of them all. This featured so many beautiful girls, so many beautiful ideas. Next, if we see this next slide, we will see Imogene Wilson, who was one of the great Follies showgirls. And if you'll remember, this is the showgirl we used for our poster of Follies. This is Imogene Wilson. The themes for these shows they would show girls in laces of the world, jewels of the world, girls for every month of the year. There were all these spectacles that would happen. And this particular Follies was written by Irving Berlin, and the trademark song for the Follies came from this. So I'd like you to hear this beautiful song that Irving Berlin wrote and look at the beautiful girls that Mr. Ziegfeld created. It's sung by Joe Sark, and I think all of you will know this song. Joe?
A pretty girl is like a melody that haunts you night and day, just like the strain of a haunting refrain. She'll start upon a marathon and run around your brain. You can't escape. She's in your memory by morning, night, and noon. She will leave you and then come back again. A pretty girl is just like a pretty tune.
Mark? This is another song from that same Follies.
Johnny was bashful and shy. Nobody understood why. Mary loved him. All the other girls passed him by. Everyone wanted to know how she could pick such a beau. with a twinkle in her eye, she gave this reply. He's not so good in a crowd, but when you get him alone, you'd be surprised. He isn't much at a dance, but then when he takes you home, you'd be surprised. He doesn't look like much of a lover, but don't judge a book by its cover. He's got the face of an angel, but there's a devil in his eyes. He's such a delicate thing, but when he starts in to squeeze, you'd be surprised. He doesn't look very strong, but when you sit on his knee, you'd be surprised. At a party or at a ball, I've got to admit he's nothing at all, but in a Morris chair, you'd be surprised. Mary continued to praise Johnny's remarkable ways to the ladies, and you know advertising pays. Now Johnny's never alone. He has the busiest phone almost every other day. A new girl will say he's not so good in the house, but on a bench in the park, you'd be surprised. He's not so good in the light, but when he gets in the dark, you'd be surprised. I know he looks as slow as the Erie, but you don't know the half of it, dearie. He looks as cold as an Eskimo, but there's fire in his eyes. He doesn't talk very much, but when he starts in to speak, you'd be surprised. He's not so good at the start, but at the end of a week, you'd be surprised. On a streetcar or in a train, you'd think he was born without any brain, but in a taxi cab or a Model T, on a Ferris wheel or a Murphy bed, in a Morris chair, you'd be surprised.
This Follies was the year after Prohibition, of course, was enacted, so that was the big comedy topic. And there were, I think, in this Follies, there were actually 3 sketches that had to do with Prohibition, kind of like Saturday Night Live when Monica Lewinsky comes out. You know, every sketch has to be about Monica Lewinsky. So Irving Berlin was forced, not forced, but was faced with writing a song about Prohibition. And Berlin loved to write songs about music and about dancing, so he sort of combined the two and came up with this little ditty, which I will now render to you, if you'll pardon my back. 'Tis a sad, sad day for me, this day of lemonade and tea, for now my dancing aspirations haven't got a chance. In the Harlem cabarets, I used to spend my nights and days partaking of my favorite indoor sport, the shimmy dance. On the day they introduced their prohibition laws, they just went and ruined the greatest shimmy dancer, because you cannot make your shimmy shake on tea. It simply can't be done. You'll find your shakin' ain't taken unless you has the proper jazz that only comes with such drinks as Green River, Haig and Hennessy. Way out in China, among the pale Chinese, there's nothing finer than good old China teas.
But then you never saw a China doll, a shaking her chemise. No, you cannot make your shimmy shake on tea. You cannot make your shimmy shake on tea. It simply can't be done. You'll find your shakin' ain't taken. The shimmy, it is intricate, and so you need a little bit of scotch or rye to lubricate your knee. A cup of Ceylon, it may be strong or weak, won't help you flail on because it's much too meek. Besides, a drink that's soft will very often ruin your technique. No, you cannot make your shimmy shake. You cannot make your shimmy shake on tea.
There's one other great song from this Follies that's still remembered today.
I was strolling out one evening by the silvery moon. I could hear somebody singing a familiar tune. So I stopped a while to listen, not a word I wanted to miss. It was just somebody serenading, something like this. Mandy, there's a minister handy, and it sure would be dandy if we let him make a fee. So don't you linger, here's a ring for your finger. Isn't it a humdinger? Come along and let the wedding chimes bring a happy times for Mandy and me, my little Mandy. There's a minister handy, and it sure would be dandy if we let him make a fee. So don't you linger, here's a ring for your finger. Isn't it a humdinger? Come along and let the wedding chimes bring a happy times for Mandy and me.
Going to the Follies of the 20s. And to take us on that journey, we have a very special guest with us this evening. We have a lady here who is an original Ziegfeld girl. She was in the 1921 Midnight Frolics and then went on to do the 1922 and 23 Ziegfeld Follies. And I'd like you to welcome Eleanor Dara O'Connell. Did you notice that Ziegfeld walk as she came across? Did you notice that? So you started out in the Midnight Frolics on the rooftop of the Ziegfeld Theater.
1921.
1921. There's her picture up there. There she is. And the rooftop was really a club. They had telephones and tables, and it was really a nightclub.
Yes, and we did the show on the dance floor.
And did it actually started at midnight?
No, around 9.
9?
But at midnight, we were ready to caper.
Go out on the town, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. But then...
And we did.
So then you moved downstairs to the big Follies in 1922.
That's right.
And Will Rogers was in that Follies.
Yes, he was.
So what did you think of Will Rogers?
Oh, he was very well liked. Everybody liked him. He was real homespun, and everybody liked him. No pretense, just a regular guy.
And you met Betty Blake and his family. They would come to the Follies.
Yes.
Yeah. And the audience, he would just go out and do his little comedy
Twirling.
thing with the twirling and
Yeah.
do the newspaper, read the newspaper.
That's right. And he would take a headline from a newspaper that day, that morning, something usually about the stock market or the brokers down in Broadway or just anything, And he would turn it into a real nice little story with a light little comic touch, and everybody would howl at him,
And you were a dancer in that Follies.
Yes.
And what were some of the numbers you did in the Follies?
Well, we did a South Sea number with Gilda Gray. We did a ballet number with Mary Eaton. We did a tap and strut number with one of the men dancers that was very good at it. And that was it. I mean, we did all kinds of dancing in those days.
Now
Nobody special,
Uh-huh. But you were telling me, we were talking earlier about the fact that everybody thinks that the Follies was filled with nudity.
It wasn't.
It wasn't. What was the illusion, the mystique?
Well, the illusion was the girls had on body stockings that looked just like their flesh, and usually they were draped with bits of chiffon, and everybody thought they were naked under the chiffon.
But they were quite beautiful.
They were very beautiful girls.
And
very beautiful girls in every Follies.
And the one lady
amazingly beautiful. And they came from all over the country.
And would he go all over to find them?
Yes.
Yeah.
They would come from all over the country. Just beautiful girls, one after the other.
There was one lady you were talking about, Anastasia Riley.
Oh, yes. She was excellent. She was from Brooklyn. And I used to look at her because it was amazing. Her skin was just like a gardenia flower. And she had bright green eyes and black hair. And the combination was just breathtaking. She was a very beautiful girl. She wound up marrying Ziegfeld's nephew and lived in Detroit for a while, but she then passed on.
Now, when you would put the Follies together, how long would you rehearse them?
The rehearsals are always 4 weeks.
4 weeks.
Uh-huh.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Ziegfeld, did you see him much?
Not very much. He usually said to the people that were going to teach us something, whether it was a song or a dance, he would tell them what he wanted and expected, and they just followed through, and then we did it. He didn't speak too much to us as far as directing us anywhere. He would speak through little pleasantries, pass the time of day or ask how you were or things like that. But he never spoke business. Mm-mm.
Now, what about the idea of Ziegfeld's favorite? We were talking about Lillian Lorraine.
Oh, well, Lillian Lorraine was his sweetheart, yes.
And we were talking about why he married Billy Burke instead of Lillian. What was your opinion of it?
Well, she got into a few capers that weren't quite up to his standards, and she kind of slipped away, and then it was time for him to carry on somewhere else.
But he really wasn't he didn't have a lot of girls that were in the show.
No, he did not. He did not. He was not a womanizer at all.
Although the rumors were that he was, or at least that's the mystique that's grown up around him.
Well, naturally, you get 50 beautiful girls around you, and they're all oohing and ahhing, and so they think, well, he had his pick. He did have his pick, but he didn't pick.
Now, you actually appeared in the New Amsterdam Theater.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And recently, when it was remodeled.
Oh, it's been remodeled.
And you've been back.
It has been remodeled, and it is exquisite. It has only been remodeled back to how it was originally. There's nothing new in it. It has been restored, and in such a beautiful fashion, really. I was there earlier today, taping something. And whenever I go, I always find something new that I remember from the early days. It's a beautiful, beautiful theater.
And you actually made an appearance there this spring.
Oh, this spring, about 6 weeks ago, there was a show. We put a show on for 2 afternoons, and it was called The Bears. We were it was a charity affair for Equity Knows and shares. And we had some beautiful numbers. And one of the other Ziegfeld girls who lives out of town now, but she did a dance number. She was 94 years old, and she did a dance number, tap dance, and she had all these boys behind her doing the same dance, and she was a sensation.
Uh-huh.
She was.
Yes, and of course, yeah, and you were just 1 year behind her, right?
And, excuse me, incidentally, Incidentally, I forgot to tell you, she was on Rosie O'Donnell's show after it. I don't know whether any of you saw her on Rosie O'Donnell, but that was a Ziegfeld girl that did that tap dancing.
But you actually got to perform once again on the stage. And how many years had it been between your performances?
I was telling him earlier that I was there in 1922 doing my little stuff here and there. And I waited 76 years to get back on the New Amsterdam stage.
Well, we're glad you did get back on the stage.
Yeah, and you know what? Ever since then, I haven't been off of it. I was there today.
Well, and actually, now you told me...
So I don't know whether that's a good sign.
Well, I think it's a very good sign. Now, there is a piece of stained glass that had to be replaced in the New Amsterdam Theater. And what happened with that?
When they were restoring it, the lobby is a very beautiful place, but up where you're going to deposit your ticket to enter the theater, there are some glass panels, and one panel stuck way up there by the ceiling was broken, and they had to replace it. And the lady that was going to decorate that panel didn't know what to do. But she had read an article about me in the New York Times, and my photograph, as I looked in 1922, was in the photo. So she took my picture and she put it in stained glass. And I'm amazed because of all the beautiful women that work for Ziegfeld, I'm the only Ziegfeld girl with my picture there.
There were over 3,000 girls originally that were Ziegfeld girls, and now there are only a few left that are official Ziegfeld girls.
There's about 10.
And you're the national.
In the whole country, yeah.
You are the national president of the Ziegfeld Club.
Yes, I am.
And tell us about what the club does and how it operates.
The club is benevolent. We do things for people that are in the theater that need help of any kind, and we constantly contribute to the Actors Fund, and recently to Equity Cares, and not only in New York, but in Florida. We have a branch down there, and we did originally have a branch in California, but it had to go out of business. There were no more Ziegfeld people out there. So what we like to have is people, excuse me, that would write and let us know your address, and we can let you know when we have our little affairs. We have nice lunches and various things coming up. And
if you'd like,
I'd like to have them on the mailing list.
Yeah, if you'd like to be on the mailing list, on your little thing that you're going to put the money in, you know, just write on there, please put me on the mailing list for the Ziegfeld Club and your address, and we'll make sure that Dana gets it.
And it's $35 to join. So, but we do put on very nice shows. We're going to put on a wonderful one for next Thanksgiving at the New York Athletic Club. No, pardon me, that's another affair. I was going to be at the Marriott Hotel. Yeah.
Great. So please be on their mailing list. I think you'll find out a lot of interesting things about the Ziegfeld girls and what they're doing now, live and kicking. Now, Dana's going to stay out here with me. We're going to go on now through the years, and I think Dana will help us out with subsequent years at the Follies. We're going to now talk about Ruth Edding.
Oh, yes.
Who was a lovely performer.
A lovely performer, had a beautiful voice, had a very disagreeable husband.
Her husband. Now, if any of you have seen the famous movie with Doris Day and James Cagney called Love Me or Leave Me, that's the story of Ruth Etting. And her manager, who became her husband, was the Gimp. He was a gangster who really, it's sort of a Phantom of the Opera story practically. He really believed in her and really helped her career, but it was a very strange relationship. She eventually was able to divorce him. The man that she was in love with was her arranger and songwriter for her, and the Gimp actually shot him, but didn't kill him. He went to jail for a little while, got out, but then everything worked out sort of all right in the end. And that, if you've ever seen the movie, that's the story of Love Me or Leave Me, which is a great picture. And in that picture, Doris Day sings the song which Ruth Etting first sang when she sang in the 1927 Follies, Shakin' the Blues Away, and here we have Betsy Craig to sing it for us now. Betsy?
There's an old superstition way down south. Everybody believes that troubles will stay if you shake 'em away. When they hold a revival way down south, everybody with cares and troubles that day tries to shake 'em away, shaking the blues away, unhappy news away. If you are blue, it's easy to shake off your cares and troubles, telling the blues to go. They may refuse to go, but as a rule they'll go if you'll shake 'em away. Do like the voodoos do, listening to a voodoo melody. They shake their bodies so to and fro. With every shake, a lucky break, proving that there's a way to shake your cares away. If you must lose your weary blues, shake 'em away. Do like the voodoos do, listening to a voodoo melody. They shake their bodies so, with every shake, a lucky break, proving that there's a way to shake your cares away. If you would lose your weary blues, shake 'em away, shake 'em away, shake 'em away.
Now, I'd like to ask Michael to come back out here. 1927 was also the year that Ziegfeld moved to his own theater, the Ziegfeld Theater, and it was designed by Joseph Urban. So we continue the Joseph Urban story with Michael Anania, and we hear about Ziegfeld's own theater.
In 1926, Ziegfeld commissioned Urban with Thomas Lamb to create a new theater at 54th Street and 6th Avenue. And the next slide should show us the exterior of that new theater.
There it is.
There it is, Ziegfeld Theater, in all its Art Deco splendor. Very different kind of facade than we saw with the New Amsterdam. Very sleek and very modern.
They tore it down.
It opened on February 2nd, 1927. And the next slide will show us some of the interior of the new theater. Very sleek, very much of the Art Deco period with all these murals that wrapped around. It's the proscenium arch. You can see it's, again, not Baroque or ornate. It's very simple in the Art Deco style with some simple drapery and a grand act curtain. The next slide will show us Flo Ziegfeld's private lobby underneath his office, which was behind the auditorium or the house. Very beautiful ceilings, murals. And the next slide This is a design for the murals that were all over the ceiling of the Ziegfeld Theater, designed by Urban and his protege.
Quite unique, really. I mean, I don't think they'd ever seen a theater like this before.
No, it was totally a new experience.
Did you actually get to visit the theater? Did you see shows in the theater?
Yes, yes. I know this theater very well, the Ziegfeld Theater. They tore it down now.
I know. It actually was where the Ziegfeld movie theater is now.
Yeah.
But they tore it down.
No, it wasn't.
Oh, it wasn't exactly there?
No.
Was it in that neighborhood, though? It was
Yes.
more uptown, right?
It was 54th and 7th Avenue. Yeah, 6th Avenue.
54th and 6th.
Yeah, 6th. But I don't know why they ever tore it down. It was beautiful.
Isn't that a shame?
They did.
Yeah.
And the next slide. This is the levee scene from Showboat, designed by Urban, done in the
was that
theater.
actually in that theater, or was it in the New Amsterdam? Or
This was 1927, I believe it was in the new theater.
But wasn't Rio Rito in there at the same time?
It was in the new one, but not, yes, the new one.
It was, okay. As you know, to just
I don't
catch
think
up.
it opened it. I think Rio Rita opened. Was
Yes.
the first new show.
And then
That's so.
And then
Showboat.
Then Showboat.
Yeah.
And to harken back, Showboat was quite the groundbreaking musical at that time. You know, Ziegfeld, to produce it, was quite amazing because everyone thought, well, it's going to be this thing about showgirls and a beautiful show again. But it was really the first truly dramatic musical that had a gripping story and compelling storyline, and it really was a groundbreaking.
It was done in a fabulous manner. The voices and the music, everything about it was exquisite. Well, it's a masterpiece. You can always refer to it. It's beautiful, and the music too.
It must have been thrilling. Do you think everybody just immediately knew it was something special, or was it so different that they didn't realize it?
Well,
at the time?
it was special because it was most unusual for Ziegfeld to produce a show like that, something with the story running through it. It was fabulous. It'll never die. I mean, you can always bring that show back, and there'll always be people that'll want to see and hear it.
I think we have some more pictures from that,
Yes,
too.
we do. I think actually the next slides are from Rio Rita, which opened the New Ziegfeld Theater. This was a shawl curtain that he designed for Rio Rita.
I remember it.
Just exquisitely designed, beautiful color. The next slide is his cactus curtain, which was also a show curtain in Rio Rita. And then let me just finish up Urban's story before Robert moves on and continues his story. We'll see some more Showboat slides in a few minutes. Urban became eventually, after the Follies closed, the artistic director of the Metropolitan Opera and designed 55 of its productions. He consistently worked on Broadway for 17 years, and his work influenced many generations of set designers. Apparently, his consistency caused critics to take his talent for granted, because his sets for Music in the Air in 1932 and Melody in 1933 received only passing attention. Melody was to be his last Broadway show, where he died in New York City, July 10th, 1933, at the age of 61. And that's his story.
Thank you, Mike.
You're welcome.
Fabulous
Thank you.
story.
Now let's see what the next slide is, because I think we have the Showboat slides coming up momentarily. We can see what's next here. This is actually another Rio Rita, I believe. Keep going. These are some of the Ziegfeld productions. This is Showboat. There's the sheet music. And if we keep going, we'll see, I think, this is the scene at the levee, which is the famous picture which many of you have seen, of course, of Showboat. And it had a huge cast. And the wonderful people, Paul Robeson, Helen Morgan.
Robeson, yes, Helen Morgan.
Was she just
Helen
something?
Morgan, when she sang that thing, My Bill.
Was it incredible?
Fabulous. Nobody's ever done it as well since. No, most of the stories about Ziegfeld, they were tied to one number that they did, and that was their history for the rest of the time. And no one ever came along that even got anywhere near to what they displayed. It was just songs that they could fit into. And that was the end of it. The end of those stars seemed to be the end of that music. And it's a shame because it was done by such beautiful people, the writers and the musicians and everything. It's a shame to let it die. And yet doesn't seem to be coming any voices coming along to be able to carry it off the way the original people that did them. It was very amazing.
You were there to hear it all.
Yes, I was there, and I enjoyed everything. I loved being with Ziegfeld. I loved it. I had a marvelous time. I knew everybody in New York, from the Battery on up to the Bronx Zoo. And I had a marvelous time. Unfortunately, I seem to have outlived most of them. They weren't drinking the same thing as me.
They weren't drinking the same thing as you, yes, that's true. Let's see the next slide. The next slide, I think, is our production of Showboat. So there we continue on. As you know, we were able to do that on PBS. That was great. I think somewhat in the Ziegfeld tradition. Now, Ziegfeld went on to do other shows that were not Ziegfeld Follies shows, but were very big hits. Whoopi was one of the big ones, starring Eddie Cantor. Yeah. Did you get to see that as well?
Yep.
And what was Eddie Cantor like? We've heard so much about him.
Well, he was kind of a breezy entertainer, bouncing all over the stage, back and forth, you know. And
he had a lot of energy.
Energy, yes. He had that.
And very lovable. You just kind of.
Yes, he was a very nice person. I knew him quite well. And I knew his wife, Ida, that he used to sing about. And he was nice. He had daughters. And he was a very nice family man besides.
And he actually was one of the founders of Actors Equity, I believe. He was very philanthropic.
Yes. And incidentally, I was at the beginning of Actors Equity. I had, I had taken a summer vacation from high school. High school, mind you. I had been taking ballet lessons, and the ballerina I was studying with worked at the Hippodrome. Does anybody remember the Hippodrome at 43rd Street and 6th Avenue? Well, all right. She was also engaged there doing some ballet work and one thing or another. And she thought it would be very nice. I went to Washington Irving High School in Manhattan, and I lived in the Village. And I was taking these, my mother thought that I ought to have a few ballet lessons so that I wouldn't be awkward walking in a room, or, you know, be able to do little courtesies, I suppose. And I took ballet lessons, and she worked there. And she thought when I had my summer vacation from Washington Irving High School, it'd be very nice if I could work there for 2 months to get stage deportment, she said. Well, I got there, and there was another girl there of my size and just about my age and probably doing the same thing, too. But I wound up in a pair of old-fashioned pajamas with feet, carrying a candle, and leading a baby elephant. Now, that's about as near as I got to ballet while I was there for 2 months. So when I got through with that, the other girl that was near my age said, there's going to be a call for girls for George White's scandals. She says, let's go, let's see if they ever pick us. And of course, 15 and you're in school and you could go for the lark. Well, it was a lark, all right, because we both were accepted. So we wound up in George White's scandals in 1920.
My goodness.
Of course, I had a bit of a problem. I had to get past my father on that one.
I guess you did. How did you manage that?
Somehow or other, I talked him out of it. And he once said to me, he said, you know, he says, you would charm a bird off a tree. So I think of that occasionally when I want something very, very important.
Now then, when you actually went from the scandals to the Follies, was that considered a step up?
Oh, yes, yes. And it was nice working for Georgie White. He was breezy, he was fine, you know, walked around with a little swagger and a straw hat on the side of his head, you know. And he was very bouncy. We had to rehearse at night because he wanted to be at the racetrack all day.
Can you believe that? That's incredible.
Yeah.
Let's look at the remainder of our slides so we can finish our story here. I think these slides are all from Ziegfeld, the productions of Ziegfeld Follies type shows. Ziegfeld actually produced one movie, but he really wasn't known
No,
for films.
he
He
was-
really was a stage
Okay.
producer.
What's this?
But this was, actually, I think this was actually, no, this wasn't the scene from the movie. It's hard for us to see these close up. These were from the Ziegfeld, one of the Ziegfeld Follies films, I believe. I can't tell too well from where we're sitting. What's the next one? Let me see where we are here. Okay, and then these are just various posters from the various follies. If we'll go on through these till we get to Pam's picture.
Well, that's a Midnight Frolic up there.
Uh-huh, uh-huh. Can you see them? Yeah, just all those lovely, the aesthetic of the follies was just so incredible.
Yeah.
He would go on to produce other musicals, The Three Musketeers, Sally, Betsy, Rio Rita, Rosalie, Whoopi, Showgirl, Simple Simon,
Oh, yeah.
and, oh, you see, now we're back to our follies, but in the style of his follies, as you
Yeah.
can tell. And here's our lovely Pam, who's in our production now as our Ziegfeld's favorite.
Yes, that's right,
Yeah, with the Ziegfeld Follies sign. We'd like to conclude this evening with some songs from the various shows that weren't from the Follies. And we'd like to do first 3 songs that were from Bittersweet. But before we do, I want to bring us up to date with his story so we can conclude. In 1929, the crash happened, and as we said earlier, Mr. Ziegfeld lost everything, about $1 million, but Billie Burke, his wife, bailed him out and kept his show running and kept him going. But it really was, I think, the end for him. It really was a devastating blow.
When he went to California, he was spent, you know. Yeah.
It was, he never really recovered from that.
No.
They actually made a film of Whoopi at that time,
Yeah.
which I think he went out to be a part of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So the last Follies he did was in 1931. And the irony, it wasn't a terribly successful Follies compared to the other ones, but the irony was that the most successful song in that Follies was Ruth Edding's rendition of Shine on Harvest Moon, which was from the very beginning. And so the opulence that Ziegfeld stood for didn't quite make sense in the Depression years. And that whole era really was coming to an end, and the Ziegfeld touch was really something that wasn't a part of what the Depression was all about. He died on July 22nd in 1932 in California. Will Rogers arranged his funeral, and Billie Burke came to stay with Will Rogers and his wife Betty Blake. Isn't it interesting that they both had, Betty Blake and Billie Burke, these BB wives, you know. She stayed with them, and Will Rogers took care of everything, which is kind of interesting. They were really very close. Another interesting thing about Will Rogers, he never put any money really in the bank, not much. He kept all his paychecks in his pocket. He'd have 10 or 12 in there at a time, and then when he needed money, he'd just take one out and cash it. He was very simple in that respect. You know, he wasn't very complicated when it came to all of that business dealings. It was a handshake, and I need the money, I'll use it.
Yeah, he was like that.
Yeah.
No, money didn't mean a thing to him.
When you heard that Ziegfeld had died, what was the effect of that on everyone?
Oh, everybody just felt terrible. But we were sort of prepared for it because he was going down. We came to get sorry then. I mean, we felt very bad of his demise. I wanted him to be up on high, you know, and just retire nicely, gracefully, but it wasn't to be.
Yeah.
But he was his own worst enemy. He was the most generous man. And in those days, the average salary was $75, which was unheard of. Unheard of to be able to earn that for 9 performances a week.
It doesn't sound like much now, but when you think about what the dollar was worth then.
That's yeah, those days.
Yes. I mean, when I started working in the early 70s, the minimum was $145 in the 1970s. So you can imagine what $75 was back in the 20s.
We were all very well paid, and there was very little that we ever needed. He was most generous.
Now, we'd like to sing some songs for you to wrap up this evening, but before we do, I'd like you to help me thank Dana for joining us this evening. Isn't she wonderful? No, you stay. You're going to listen. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
So now we're going to sing some songs that I'm sure Dana will know, because I'm sure she saw all the shows that these songs were from. First, 3 songs from Bittersweet. Bittersweet was Noel Coward operetta, which he wasn't really known very often for operettas. It has a beautiful score, and Mr. Ziegfeld brought that to America. And you'll hear how beautiful the songs are. And we're going to follow that with a medley of songs from various Ziegfeld productions. We're actually not singing anything from Showboat because you all know that music, so we're singing some other ones for you tonight. So we'll start with 3 songs from Bittersweet. Though life buffets me obscenely, it serenely goes on. Although I question its conclusion, illusion is gone. Night after night have to look bright, whether you're well or ill. People must laugh their fill, you mustn't sleep till dawn comes creeping. Though I never really grumble, life's a jumble indeed, and in my efforts to succeed, I've had to formulate a creed. I believe in doing what I can, crying when I must, in laughing when I choose. Hey ho, if love were all, I should be lonely. I believe the more you fall in love, the more you give your trust, the more you're bound to lose. Although when shadows fall, I think if only somebody splendid really needed me, someone affectionate and dear, cares would be ended if I knew that she wanted to have me near. But I believe that since my life began, the most I've had is just a talent to amuse. Hey ho, if love were all. Hey ho, if love were all. I'll see you again whenever spring breaks through again. Time may lie green. But what has been is past forgetting. This sweet memory across the years will come to me. There may well make alright in my heart whenever just the echo of a sigh. You know this song.
10 cents a dance, that's what they pay me. Gosh, how they weigh me down. 10 cents a dance, pansies and rough guys, tough guys who tear my gown.
Look for the silver lining whene'er a cloud appears in the blue. Remember, somewhere the sun is shining, and so the right thing to do is make it shine for you.
There's blue skies smiling at me, nothing but blue skies do I see.
Never saw the sun shining so bright, never saw things going so right.
Noticing the days hurrying by, when you're in love, my, how they fly.
I could cry salty tears. Where have I been all these years? Little while, tell me now, how long has this been going on?
Another bride, another groom, another sunny honeymoon, another season, another reason for making whoopee. A lot of shoes, a lot of rice. The groom is nervous, he answers twice. It's really killing that he's so willing to make whoopee. Picture a little love nest down where the roses cling.
Picture that same sweet love nest. Think what a year can bring me. Oh, leave me and let me be lonely. You won't believe me, but I love you only.
She sits alone most every night. He doesn't phone her, he doesn't write. He says he's busy, but she says, is he? He's making whoopee. Whoopee. Liza, Liza, skies are gray. But if you'll smile on me, all the clouds will roll away. Liza, Liza, don't delay. Come keep me company, and the clouds will roll away. See, lights are shining down. Another bride, another groom, another sunny honeymoon. So Liza,
Shine on, harvest moon, up in the sky. I ain't had no love since January, February, June, or July. No time, ain't no time to stay. A pleasant moon, so shine on, harvest moon, for me and my gal.
Let's all bow together. Thank you, Albert. Albert Evans.